The Indiana Fever made a series of moves that immediately sparked debate across the league. And not because they were subtle, they dealt away the 10th overall pick in the 2026 draft for a guard they didn't exactly need, leaned even harder into an already crowded backcourt, and left Aaliyah Boston as the lone true anchor inside. On top of that, head coach Stephanie White openly suggested she wants Caitlin Clark handling the ball less. Then came media day. Clark didn't dodge a single question. No frustration, no visible tension, just calm, controlled answers from start to finish. But sometimes, that kind of composure hits harder than emotion. Because when you listen closely, a few of her responses raise bigger questions about how this roster is actually being built, and who is really shaping its direction. And it all got even more interesting when you look at the timing. Just 2 weeks before the 2026 WNBA draft, Raven Johnson went on the I Am Athlete podcast and opened up about her past matchups with Caitlin Clark at Iowa versus South Carolina. She said those games and the wave-off moment from the 2023 Final Four created a wave of online backlash that hit her hard mentally, to the point where she questioned continuing basketball at all. That clip spread everywhere. So when the Fever stepped up at pick number 10 and called her name, the reaction was instant. Social media lit up. Some fans loved it, others were confused, and plenty were asking the same question: why another guard? Because from a roster standpoint, the issue in Indiana was never the backcourt. Going into that draft, the Fever were already stacked with guards. Caitlin Clark, Kelsey Mitchell, Tyasha Harris, Sophie Cunningham, and Lexi Hull all competing for time. The real weakness was obvious: size, front court depth, and a consistent stretch presence next to Aaliyah Boston. That's where most analysts pointed the concern. Outlets like Sports Illustrated and Athlon Sports both noted the same thing. Indiana needed help inside, not another guard rotation piece. So when Johnson, a defensive specialist and former SEC Defensive Player of the Year from South Carolina, was selected, the fit didn't immediately make basketball sense on paper. Her defensive reputation is solid, but questions have followed her around regarding offensive consistency and outside shooting at the WNBA level, and the timing made everything feel even heavier, coming just weeks after she publicly spoke about emotional struggles tied in part to Clark's on-court moment years ago. From the outside, it looked messy, like a front office decision that ignored optics and roster balance at the same time. But the narrative didn't stay there for long, because Caitlin Clark herself eventually addressed Johnson and shifted the entire conversation. During training camp discussions, Clark spoke specifically about Johnson's ability to bring the ball up, handle pressure, and relieve full court defensive attention. In practical terms, that means possessions where Clark doesn't have to absorb traps, physical pressure, and 94 feet of defensive attention before even initiating offense. Over a long season, that kind of support changes everything. And then came another detail that most people missed. Clark confirmed in a separate interview that the Fever front office actually involved her in off-season conversations, including free agency and roster direction, which means she was not just aware of the Johnson selection, but had input in it. So what some fans rushed to label as a questionable or disconnected decision was, according to Clark, something she was at least part of approving. Meanwhile, Raven Johnson didn't walk into camp with tension or hesitation. Instead, she praised Clark, talked about how many questions she asked her about the offense, and kept her message simple and focused. In her words, the past is the past. Now it's about winning. And so far, the expected locker room drama hasn't really shown up anywhere. Which brings the conversation back to basketball. Yes, the guard rotation is crowded. Yes, the fit looks unusual on paper. But internally, Indiana seems to view Johnson as a pressure release valve, a defender and secondary handler meant to reduce Clark's workload over the course of games, not compete with her role. That shifts the real question. It's not just whether Raven Johnson belongs on this roster, it's whether this single move, even if intentional, is enough to fix the deeper structural issue Indiana has been dealing with all offseason. Because while everyone focused on the backcourt drama, the Fever still walked through free agency without truly solving the biggest problem on the roster. They added Monique Billings and Maisha Hines-Allen, but neither profiles as a true floor spacing power forward who can consistently stretch defenses and open the paint next to Aaliyah Boston, and that gap still looms large. So the debate isn't really over, it's just shifted from who Indiana drafted to whether the roster around its stars actually fits the way this team wants to play going forward. Indiana had multiple chances to change the shape of its roster, and to add size, shooting, and front court depth that could actually take pressure off Aaliyah Boston. Instead, the pattern stayed the same. More guards, less balance, and a front line that still looks dangerously thin when the stakes rise. And that's where the concern really starts to set in. Because in a playoff setting, this isn't just a rotation question anymore. It becomes survival. Imagine Boston in a high-intensity series against a team rolling out 2 legitimate bigs they can rotate without losing physicality. She's already pushing 35+ minutes a night simply because there's no reliable backup behind her. By the 4th quarter, the wear shows. Legs gone, energy fading, and the opponent knows exactly where to attack. Every possession becomes the same story. Force it inside, test her stamina, and wear her down until something breaks. That isn't exaggeration. It's the natural outcome when a roster has no true insurance behind its only interior anchor. One analyst even put it bluntly, Indiana doesn't really have a functional backup plan for Boston right now. And that's the reality the Fever are quietly sitting in heading into the season. The closest thing Indiana has added to a traditional stretch big is Justine Pate, a 2nd-round pick out of Vanderbilt who signed a player development contract on April 17th, 2026. And in fairness, she's not a typical front court player. At 6 feet 4 inches with a 7-foot wingspan, Pate brings a skill set that stands out immediately. She can stretch the floor, run the court, and operate outside the paint instead of being anchored under the rim. That alone gives her a different kind of value in today's spacing-heavy game. Her final season at Vanderbilt showed exactly why she's intriguing. 11.1 points per game, while shooting 42.2% from 3 on 6.6 attempts a night. That kind of volume from a front court player changes defensive decisions. It pulls bigs away from the rim, opens driving lanes, and creates cleaner offensive reads for guards like Caitlin Clark that traditional power forwards simply don't provide. On paper, that fit matters, but the contract structure tells another story. Because Pate is on a developmental deal, she doesn't fully count against the cap unless Indiana converts her contract. She can also appear in up to 12 games without losing that status. In other words, she's not a locked-in rotation piece. She's an evaluation project at a position the Fever clearly needed to solve with certainty. And that's where things get more interesting. During training camp, Clark made a subtle but pointed comment about wanting teammates who can shoot and run the floor. She didn't direct it at any guard specifically, but analysts immediately connected the idea to players like Pate. Someone who fits that space and move big archetype. It's not hard to understand why. Clark thrives in space. The more shooting around her, the more dangerous Indiana becomes. A mobile front court piece who can pull defenders away from the paint fits that vision almost perfectly. The issue is the gap between potential and reliability. A developmental big is one thing. A proven veteran who can hold up in a Game 5 playoff environment is something else entirely. And that gap still hasn't been addressed. With 2 roster spots still open heading into the final phase before the season, those decisions now carry real weight. They are essentially the last chance Indiana has to correct the imbalance it created by stacking the backcourt instead of reinforcing the frontcourt. Clark's comments about spacing and movement start to sound less like casual praise and more like a very direct blueprint for what she wants those final roster spots to become. But whether the front office is truly aligned with that vision is still unclear, and that uncertainty only grows when you look at how the coaching staff is framing the system. Stephanie White has been clear during training camp about the identity she wants Indiana to play with in 2026. Faster tempo, stronger defense, and less dependence on Caitlin Clark initiating every possession 94 feet from the basket. White put it bluntly, explaining that the goal is to get Clark into the 2nd or 3rd action of a possession instead of forcing her to start everything from scratch. She also pointed to players like Raven Johnson as part of that solution. Guards who can bring the ball up, absorb pressure, and initiate offense before handing things over to Clark. On paper, that's a workload management strategy. Fans heard something slightly different, fewer primary ball handling responsibilities for Clark, and both interpretations have a point. Over a 44-game season, constantly facing full court pressure or traps just to start a possession drains energy that matters most in late game situations. Even White has acknowledged Clark's ability to function both on and off the ball, which makes lineup variation a logical approach rather than a controversial one. But none of that system talk works without something Indiana still doesn't have in place: front court stability. Because a defensive first identity only holds if you can actually get stops, secure rebounds, and protect the paint without collapsing every time your starting center sits. Right now, that foundation is still incomplete. So the real question becomes this: are you actually asking Caitlin Clark to scale back the one thing that makes her elite just to fit into a defensive system that might not even be fully supported by the roster around her? Because Clark at her best is not complicated. Give her the ball, give her space, and everything changes. She's pulling up from well beyond the arc, forcing defenses to stretch farther than they're comfortable, and the moment they overreact, lanes open everywhere. That's when Indiana becomes dangerous. In transition, it's even worse for opponents. Before the defense is set, Clark is already pushing tempo, already reading angles, already putting pressure on every retreating defender. That's where she does the most damage. But when the ball isn't in her hands, that entire gravitational effect weakens, the defense relaxes, the floor shrinks, and Indiana loses its most unpredictable weapon. You can't just replace that impact by shifting more initiation duties to Tyasha Harris or Raven Johnson. Neither of them forces defenses to collapse the same way Clark does simply by crossing half court with the ball. Clark didn't directly call out Stephanie White, but she also didn't exactly co-sign the idea either. At Media Day, she made a very deliberate point, calling herself the best transition player in the league. Not hinted at, not suggested, stated outright. And in the same breath, she emphasized that transition is where she thrives, and everyone around her understands that's her game. That's not a throwaway comment. You don't say that in a controlled media setting unless you're making your role crystal clear. She went even further by referencing Steph Curry and how Golden State uses him off the ball at times. Not as a downgrade, but as a strategic shift, moving without the ball to create chaos in different ways. Clark acknowledged that over a long season, there are moments where playing off ball makes sense, and she's willing to do it when the situation calls for it. But that's where the interpretation gets twisted, because agreeing to situational off-ball usage is not the same as agreeing to a system where she's no longer the primary engine. Curry's off-ball movement works because Golden State already has elite initiation and structure in place. Indiana, as currently constructed, is asking Clark to give up initiation to players who don't consistently create the same defensive panic she does. That's a major difference. White's system depends on Clark accepting a reduced initiating role in key stretches. Clark, on the other hand, has been very intentional about showing she is not built to be minimized in those moments. What makes this even more misunderstood is how people interpreted Media Day. Online, it turned into a narrative that Clark was indirectly criticizing her own front office or sending warning signals through careful wording. That's not really what happened. She was calm, measured, and specific. She talked about staying healthy through a long season. She talked about chemistry building with new teammates. She talked about trusting the structure the front office has put together. On the surface, that's professionalism, nothing controversial, but the key details matter more than the tone. She confirmed she was consulted on roster decisions, including free agency and the draft. She talked about wanting teammates who can shoot and run, and didn't direct that toward any particular guard, but the message was clear. She also unprompted called herself the league's best transition player, and referenced Steph Curry's usage pattern to explain how she views offensive flexibility. That combination isn't random, it's intentional framing. She's not calling anyone out by name. She's not publicly rejecting Stephanie White's system, but she is clearly defining what she believes maximizes her game and letting everyone else connect the dots. That's a more controlled form of pressure. It's not confrontation, it's clarity, because it puts the front office in a position where disagreeing publicly would mean indirectly arguing with their own franchise players' basketball identity. What she's really drawing is a boundary line. She'll adapt situationally, but she won't be redefined as something she's not, and she was careful enough that anyone listening closely can see that distinction. The 2026 season now circles one central tension. Can Stephanie White's defensive structure and Clark's transition-driven offense actually coexist without one limiting the other? Clark's Media Day messaging suggests she's already made her internal conclusion. She's not planning to fade into a secondary role in the moments that matter most. And she's communicating that without direct conflict, just through precise language about how she sees the game. Meanwhile, none of the structural issues in Indiana disappeared just because the messaging was polished. Aaliyah Boston is still carrying the entire interior load alone. The final roster spots are still unresolved, and the front court still lacks a consistent stretch presence that can actually actually balance the floor. Even with Justine Pate developing and the guards already in place, the overall construction still feels incomplete. That's the reality underneath everything. If everything clicks, Clark healthy, Boston supported, shooters spacing the floor, and the right final pieces added, Indiana has real potential to compete in 2026. But that if is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Clark's confidence at Media Day didn't feel like performance. It felt like perspective. A player who has been through enough scrutiny to know exactly what matters and what doesn't. So when fans express frustration heading into the season, it isn't coming from nowhere. The roster gaps are real, the fit questions are real, and the philosophical tension between system and star is still unresolved. Clark has already made her position clear. She's told you what she needs. She's shown how she sees her role, and she's explained the kind of basketball she believes works best for her. Now the question shifts away from her and lands squarely on the system being built around her, because at some point, something has to give. So what do you think? Was Stephanie White the right coach to build around Caitlin Clark's style, or are they heading toward a philosophical clash that only becomes clearer once the season starts?